Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be back at the ANU. Actually, I did not receive my PhD from the ANU. However, I was here for a year, and I am extremely proud of my affiliation with Australian National University, and really enjoyed my time here first in 1997, and then again as a research fellow in 2000. It's great to be here. It's great to be breathing the clean Canberra air, as opposed to the not-so-clean Hong Kong air. And today I'd like to provide an update to you of the political situation in Vietnam today. And as you can see, the title of my talk is somewhat provocative. In fact, I decided I would remove the question mark that was originally in the title, and affirm that, yes, indeed, these are extraordinary times. Earlier this month in Hanoi, General Viet Nam passed away. He was over 100 years old, and the observance of his death occasioned a very interesting, unscripted moment in Vietnam's contemporary history that almost reminded me of, didn't almost remind me, it did remind me of David Marr's account of the death and funeral of Phan Chu Trinh, 1925, if I'm not mistaken, in which hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, Vietnamese together observed the passing of a major figure in Vietnam's anti-colonial history. And certainly General Giap himself was a major figure in Vietnam's anti-colonial history. Of course, his death was observed in a variety of different ways. Some people experienced it from the perspective of the war experiences in the north of Vietnam or in the south of Vietnam. Some people who perhaps were born even after much, if not all of those wars occurred, responded in a very emotional way. You can see that the individual in the red shirt is a little bit perplexed by this response. And, of course, there was, after several days of unscripted observations of General Giap's passing, a very official ceremony, which I was fortunate enough to have attended. These are extraordinary times in Vietnam, in part because the country is experiencing a great deal of economic turbulence, and we'll be hearing more about this from our second speaker. It's also an interesting time because there is a sense and a reality that the apparatuses of power in Vietnam have become somehow undermined, fragmented, even rendered ineffectual by the rise of various interests within the state who are perceived to be hurting the national interests. And perhaps most strikingly, particularly for someone interested in political change, is the arrival of what is perhaps somewhat convolutedly, I suppose, but perhaps is best termed as the arrival of a public political discourse that is unmediated. One hesitates to call it a public sphere, given all of the ramifications of Habermas's use of that term. Nonetheless, when I talk about extraordinary times in Vietnam, I'm talking about a process of destabilization of long prevailing power relations within the party and within the state. I'm talking about the destabilization of power relations between the state and its social environment. And in particular, the rise of what we might call the space of secondary associations. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And Vietnam's position in the international order is also changing in interesting ways, not only due to exogenous factors such as global economic turbulence, the ever-increasing demands that China seems to be imposing on the region, but also because of Vietnam's own changing engagement with the international order. And that includes members of Vietnam's party and state, but also ordinary folks in Vietnam who are experiencing and engaging with the world politically in ways that they haven't in the past. Now, I'm not used to giving political updates, and I will avoid what perhaps is the convention, which is to go through a laundry list of developments that have occurred since the last Vietnam political update 2 years ago. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is to provide the broad contours of political change in Vietnam over the last year or two. And I'm going to do so by addressing 3 fields. The first is what we might refer to as elite politics and Vietnam's mainline political institutions. The second, I'm going to talk about associational life, as I indicated, particularly with respect to the rise of a public political discourse that is relatively unmediated by the state. And third, I'm going to talk a bit about the international order. I have 30 minutes to do so, and I probably already burned about 10 minutes. So I'm already in trouble, but let's see if I can recover. Vietnam today is characterized by a state of what we might call fractious pluralism. Of course, there's always been pluralism within the Communist Party of Vietnam, as there has been, as there is in any political party. Could somebody close that door? Thanks. What has perhaps changed is that this fractious pluralism is more transparent than it's been in the past. In fact, within the last 2 years, we've seen our fair share of political brinksmanship right out in the open. We're not used to peering into the black box of the Communist Party of Vietnam, its Central Committee, and the Politburo. So we have an interesting set of conflicts and perhaps points of consensus, too, within the party. But one question that emerges in the general discussion about Vietnam today is, are we seeing the rapid breakdown of party discipline, the need to be thống nhất, the need to be united, or are we seeing the development, the maturation of political pluralism in Vietnam? It's unclear. There is tremendous interest in what Vietnamese have called interest group politics. Of course, every political regime has its own interest groups. But I think perhaps now, more than in the past, the time is ripe for someone to sit down and sift through this carefully and figure out what's going on. Within the last year, we've seen a fair amount of fireworks at the top, and according to most observers, this centers on rivalry between Đồng Chí Nguyen Thanh Dũng, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Comrade Dũng, and the other triumvirate. So they make perhaps the Four Horsemen, and then there's Nguyen Phu Trong, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nguyen Sinh Hung, who is the head of the National Assembly, and of course Trung Tan Sang, who is the president of Vietnam. The fireworks at the top over the last couple of years broke out into the open around the 6th plenum of the 11th Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam, in which it was speculated that Nguyen Thanh Dũng would be subject to disciplinary action by the party. That did not occur. Instead, the Central Committee elected to reprimand and suggest the Politburo to collectively reflect on its shortcomings. It was quite a dramatic scene and without precedent, at least in the recent history of the party. We also saw the jockeying for position within the Central Party and the Central State that featured, including, among others, Nguyen Ba Thanh, who is pictured here, who was ultimately not elected to the Politburo, and instead we saw Nguyen Thien Nhân and Nguyen Thi Kim Nan, who rose to the Politburo and are sometimes associated with the Prime Minister himself. We also saw interesting developments in the National Assembly, Vietnam's formal representative body. And this graph depicts the level of polarization in the confidence voting that took place. So you can see that Nguyen Thanh Dũng was the person who received the most polarizing votes. In other words, he received the greatest number of high confidence and the greatest number of low confidence votes. Other notable figures who didn't fare particularly well were the manager of the State Bank, for understandable reasons, the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Education, both the head of ministries with sensitive portfolios. And there is the Minister of Health herself. We could spend a lot of time talking about the resolutions and decrees that have been passed within the last couple of years. There have been 369 decrees. I won't mention a single one of them except Party Resolution number 4, which came out prior to the 6th plenum of the party's Congress that was to address certain urgent problems in the construction and development of the party. But it was extraordinary that over the last couple of years, some major state events at imposing order, imposing a narrative, if you will, broke down, most notably the effort to rework the Constitution, which we will now discuss in greater detail. So let me shift briefly to a discussion of politics and associational life. And as I indicated before, I think one of the most striking developments in Vietnam is what we might call the development of an incipient public sphere, or perhaps more accurately, an incipient public discourse that is relatively unmediated. We have seen the continuation of important processes of social conflict in Vietnam, particularly relating to land. And just this month, the National Assembly decided that it would not undertake any major adjustments to land policy, so that land would remain the property of the Tuan Dân, of the whole people. And we can expect that the type of land disputes that many scholars who are presenting papers here will be addressing will continue. There were 3 notable explosions with respect to the land issue. One was in Hưng Yên with the construction of the ironically perhaps named Eco Park that resulted in the displacement of an entire village. We had the famous case in Haiphong where a person who was promised land decided to mount armed resistance. And then finally the tragic event in Thái Bình more recently when one individual decided that a way to vent his anger would be to shoot people. But really, what's occurred to me that's most interesting, and this may be my own interest, but we can discuss its significance or otherwise later, is the emergence of this new political discourse. We might even call it the new politics. We have, over the internet in particular, seen constant coverage, 24-hour coverage of Vietnamese politics, which of course is not strictly new, but it's accelerated and intensified in ways that we could hardly imagine in the past. We've seen, not only through the internet, but through other means, the development of dissident politics. Through internet and other forms of technology, we've seen the transformation of dissidents who perhaps in the past would be noted, have been transformed into folk heroes of sorts, at least controversial figures. And we have, not only in cyberspace but on the ground, seen the development of what we might refer to as social non-movements. If we think about social movements as being movements of organized people around a particular issue, there are things going on in Vietnam. It's unclear exactly what they are, but we are seeing the expansion not only of personal freedoms associated with the market, but we're seeing the expansion of political freedoms, if not in the formal sense, at least in how people actually behave. Yes, Vietnam still has 700 state-run newspapers that are widely read, some more than others. But in the meantime, people are speaking their mind in a way that is hard to imagine not too back in the distant future. We've also had other interesting developments, including the publication of Huy Duc's Ben Thang Quoc, which it means the winning side for those non-Vietnamese speakers. It's actually a 2-volume work. It's an absolutely brilliant account. It's a journalistic account, but it's outstanding. And for all of the efforts of Vietnamese who feel bad or jealous to say there's nothing new, well, actually there is something new, because most Vietnamese, probably 99%, did not have an in-depth understanding of developments over the last 20 years. And Huy Duc's book has been widely disseminated and read in Vietnam and continues to generate discussion. Perhaps the most important single development with respect to dissent in Vietnam is the publication and dissemination of Petition 72, which was signed initially by 72 intellectuals and notables, some of which are gathered in this photo. Some of the figures here are familiar to those familiar with Vietnam, in which they called for fundamental changes to Vietnam's constitution. By the way, just this past week, the National Assembly decided that there would be no significant changes in the Constitution. Nonetheless, much more significantly, the dissemination of this petition unleashed a wide-ranging discussion and debate about the Constitution, about politics in Vietnam, along the likes of which has never been seen, or at least has not been seen in many, many decades. I think that's fair to say. We've seen assorted, and she's indicating that she supports the petition. We've seen spasms of dissent, open displays of desires for political change, including a so-called human rights outing. When I blogged about this, I call it a fleeting Tocquevillian moment in Vietnam. That's perhaps an overreach, but the point was that Vietnamese were experimenting with a kind of associational life that was quite different than we're used to seeing in Vietnam. Of course, the local officials decided that it would be a good time to wash the sidewalks to prevent people from sitting on the ground. And some of the participants also were subject to physical abuse. We've also seen some quite spectacular developments with respect to trials of political dissidents and anti-establishment figures. One of the most notable trials involved the case of a young woman in the South who decided to post a sign that had the flag of the old republic and some fairly strong words for China, and she was sentenced to several years in prison, Feng Yuan. And although people interpreted her particular case differently, and not everybody was a fan of what she did, some called her naive, she nonetheless received wide support from those who thought it was not a particularly good idea to be locking up young people for expressing their political views. And she was released a few months ago. We can discuss that later if you like. There was also a statement issued by activists and bloggers that was opposed to Article 258 of the Criminal Code, which promises prison terms for people who abuse their democratic freedoms by saying things that conflict with the party line. And some of these activists made life in Vietnam more interesting than usual for diplomats when they showed up at their doorstep to present them with their complaint. This, of course, was in association with Vietnam's unlikely bid, or perhaps not so unlikely given the history of the United Nations, to find a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. And these folks were calling for Vietnam to respect its commitments to the International Convention on Human Rights. I have a paper that's in fairly rough shape. Nonetheless, in the paper, I catalog a particularly sorry development that took place in the summer, sorry that is if you're an activist, in which young bloggers were rounded up in Hanoi. This occurred right during President Tsang's trip to Washington and subject to all sorts of physical abuse. Now, it should be noted at the same time, however, that it's not as though we're facing what some people might call a one-sided affair in associational life. We've also seen the development of various groupings that are supportive of the state in Vietnam. This is an image that I recorded from an internet page called Hội Những Người Ghét Phản Động, the Association of People Who Hate Reactionaries. And so what we're seeing, with respect to the development of political space in Vietnam is this sort of efflorescence is perhaps a bit too rosy, but the rapid development of a variety of forms of relatively unmediated political speech. That's quite interesting. Lastly, let me touch on developments, I suppose, more briefly in the international sphere. Since the last Vietnam update, situation in the Southeast Asian Sea, as some people refer to it, thank you, did not improve notably, and this photograph, which was taken at the fairly disastrous ASEAN summit in Cambodia, reminds us that the potential for ASEAN to play a constructive role in resolving some of the maritime disputes, among other issues, seems to have dimmed, particularly with the influence of China with respect to Cambodia and perhaps other countries in particular. And this, of course, remains a sore spot among Vietnam's population. On the other hand, Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dũng gave a speech at the hotel chain security meetings in Singapore. I don't want to name the hotel. And it was widely praised as an effective speech on an international stage by a Vietnamese leader, and that's something relatively unusual. I think Vietnam historically has not done the best job in making its case to the world, at least the folks in Hanoi, and this was widely greeted as a particularly strong speech that talked about the need for people to behave responsibly, something that leaders in East Asia today seem to be having difficulty with. In early July, Trung Tân Sang ventured to Beijing, and then, of course, to Washington, where he exchanged pleasantries with Barack Obama and John Kerry and the others and discussed a variety of things. One of the items on the table, of course, was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which sounds very ambitious. It's unclear what it will really amount to, and the U.S. was seeking human rights improvements, not in the U.S., but in Vietnam in this instance. And more recently, it's a really tough guy, we saw the APEC summit in Indonesia take place absent Barack Obama, and people have been speculating on the significance of this event while Barack Obama was back home cleaning up the mess left over by the Tea Party. Vietnam and China were busy charting their common future. On the other hand, I think we should at least note that international politics in Vietnam is not strictly about old folks in positions of power meeting each other, but also about how Vietnamese engage with the world. And I think Vietnamese are accessing information in a way that they didn't in the past. They care about people like Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. And they do things like go to the Philippines and take a course with a Filipino NGO on civil society. And then they come back and they're detained for 5 hours at the airport. But nonetheless, they do it. And this is a sort of international politics, too. So, to conclude the discussion, there's no sense in exaggerating the situation in Vietnam. But I think it's difficult to deny that the feel of politics in Vietnam, and of course feel sounds very unscientific, but we'll say it anyways, the feel of politics in Vietnam is qualitatively different than it was in the past, even in the recent past. And the recent passing of Âu Nguyen Giáp was, in fact, a reminder. It led us to ask whether this was the end of an era and the beginning of perhaps something new in Vietnam. And of course, it's too early to know if that's true, but I think it is the case that Vietnamese today, including older people and younger people, are very interested and plugged in to the politics of the country in a way that they haven't been in the past. And I think that regardless of how one feels about politics in Vietnam, this is a very encouraging development. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan.